was the enactment of a constitution and universal suffrage.
Suffrage, the right to vote in political elections. Suffrage has been applied unevenly throughout history, for both men and women. Over the last 300 years, while many countries expanded suffrage to include more groups of men who had been previously excluded, the expansion of suffrage to women was far slower. By the late 19th century, women around the world had organized into groups to advocate for women's suffrage. While there was international cooperation between many of these groups, their national strategies were aligned to the particular political and cultural challenges they faced in their nation. By the turn of the 20th century, there was a growing sense that the woman's hour had arrived. For two countries in particular, the United States of America and Japan, the world wars of the 20th century would create social, economic, and political changes that would accelerate the path to women's suffrage. For the United States, World War I was a defining moment in the long battle for women's suffrage. When the United States declared its independence in 1776, American women initially tied their hopes for suffrage to the American Revolution's argument for natural rights, the inalienable rights mentioned at the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. Natural rights are inalienable because they can't be separated from an individual. They can be impeded or blocked by a government, but they are not granted by a government. Future President of the United States, John Adams, was a delegate at the Continental Congress in 1776 when he received a letter from his wife, Abigail Adams. She wrote,
"I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors."
She then predicted there would be a rebellion of women one day if they had no voice or representation in the government. Women's suffrage was not achieved in the United States in these early years, but the ideals contained in the founding documents of the United States inspired future generations of women to continue the fight for suffrage. The 1840s are often recognized as the official start of the American suffrage movement, with women's rights conventions in the 1840s and 1850s advocating a number of changes to the status of women. Women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, and Susan B. Anthony were just a few of the suffrage leaders who would play pivotal roles in the movement for decades to come. After the American Civil War, the end of slavery required Americans to rethink citizenship. The 14th Amendment defined who was a citizen. It was intended to make it clear that African Americans were citizens of the United States. The 15th Amendment then prohibited federal and state governments from enacting legislation that excluded citizens from voting based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This extended the right to vote to African American males. American women then began to argue that citizenship also conferred an automatic right to vote on them too. National organizations specifically dedicated to women's suffrage were formed, and the movement began to grow. By the late 19th century and early 20th century, some of the western states in the United States did expand suffrage to women. With some women allowed to vote now and others not, the fight for suffrage in America evolved once more. Now the fight was about justice and equality, and with leaders like Alice Paul, it was becoming a more militant and public fight as World War I approached. As World War I reshaped American views of national identity and purpose, it created an irrefutable argument in favor of women's suffrage. Although some organizations chose to pause some of their activism during the war, others continued the fight. A group of women known as the Silent Sentinels even picketed the White House, criticizing President Woodrow Wilson for the disconnect between his speeches about America fighting the war to protect democracy while American women at home were disenfranchised. As the protests continued, there were other changes happening. As millions of American men joined the military, they left jobs. For the first time in American history, women filled these roles in substantial numbers. It was encouraged as a patriotic, socially acceptable duty. Women were now recognized by society and by the government as vital war assets. With it so clear that women were essential to American mobilization and production, it was impossible to claim that women lacked the physical or mental fortitude to vote, when they were clearly a competent workforce, or that you could make the world safe for democracy while disenfranchising a large part of the population. After generations of activism, the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. This did not give women the right to vote, it merely removed obstacles to their exercise of that right. Now they could exercise their right to vote. For Japan, World War II would prove a critical moment in the fight for suffrage. Like in the United States, Japanese women had been working hard to achieve suffrage. Many of these efforts began to take form during the Meiji era, when Japan began to move away from being a feudal pre-industrial society. During this incredibly short period of time, Japan began a program of industrialization and modernization, quickly becoming an important world power. It also moved towards a more constitutional system of government. Many of these changes continued into the Taisho era. As more of their counterparts around the world achieved suffrage, Japanese women worked to improve the status of women in Japan. Suffrage was just one part of their fight. Japanese women faced great legal and cultural challenges as well. They were not just barred from voting, they were prohibited from expressing political opinions, they couldn't attend political meetings, and they couldn't join political parties. By the early 1920s, Japanese suffragists like Ichikawa Fusai and Hiratsuka Raicho successfully led a campaign to allow women to at least attend political meetings and discuss political ideas. In 1923, a massive earthquake struck Tokyo. To assist with disaster relief, representatives of women's organizations throughout Japan joined together to form the Tokyo Federation of Women's Organizations. While working to provide relief to victims of the earthquake, the organization continued to advocate for women's rights. When the Japanese government extended suffrage to all men in 1924, the Tokyo Federation divided into several groups, one of which had the primary mission of advancing women's suffrage. Women's organizations in Japan saw some successes, but the global Great Depression and the rise of militarism in Japan saw support for women's suffrage wane. Like their American counterparts during World War I, Japanese women played a role in World War II. As men left jobs that helped support the nation at war, women filled some of these roles, although in fewer numbers than in the case of their American counterparts. As part of wartime propaganda, women were also promoted as symbols of national pride and hope. This propaganda and the war work helped some women step out of traditional roles and overall demonstrated the value of women as national war assets. Japan's defeat in World War II would prove a critical turning point for Japanese women. As the occupation of Japan commenced in 1945, Japanese women gained an important ally in General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in Japan. Appointed to lead the occupation of Japan, General MacArthur made it clear that women's suffrage would be one of his top priorities. It was not an order from the United States government. MacArthur's orders were simple: to take charge in Japan and demilitarize the country. In his mind, though, the best way to ensure the demise of militarism in Japan was to drastically improve the status of women in the country. At this point, America's 19th Amendment was a mere 25 years old, but it was clearly so well ingrained in American national identity that the thought of women's suffrage wasn't revolutionary to MacArthur. As he would later write in his autobiography, enfranchising Japanese women was a simple yet important way to democratize and then stabilize democracy in Japan. Even before MacArthur arrived in Japan, however, Japanese women were already organizing to play a role in the rebuilding of Japan. Shigeru Yamataka, Tsuneko Akamatsu, Ichikawa Fusai, and Natsu Kawasaki co-founded the Women's Committee on Post-War Policy. Suffrage for women and the right for women to run for political office were two of their goals. These particular issues were a priority of MacArthur's headquarters, which had a specific women's section to deal with all issues related to Japanese women. This section worked with Japanese women to understand their situation, to develop occupation policy, and then push forward permanent legal changes that would enfranchise and empower Japanese women. But not all supported these efforts, and it wasn't just certain Japanese leaders. Many in the US government, as well as academic experts on Japan, felt that Japan was too traditional, that women's suffrage would be too radical of a change for the country, that women were too subservient in Japanese culture and would not vote, and that the general's attention would be better spent on the dozens of other issues Japan faced. MacArthur disagreed. So too, apparently, did the women of Japan. At MacArthur's request, the Japanese legislature revised election laws to include women for the first time. On April 10, 1946, 13 million Japanese women voted. 38 women were elected. In 1947, women's suffrage was then permanently enshrined in the Japanese Constitution. Japanese women also gained access to a number of other rights, including the right to own property, and the right to mutually consent to marriage, and the right to have an education. These were revolutionary changes. And as Ichikawa Fusai later explained in a 1964 interview, without the defeat of Japan and the occupation that followed, Japanese women would not have gained these constitutional rights as quickly as they did. Wars unleash forces that are difficult to predict or control. World War I and World War II were both periods of crisis and change, and in the case of the United States and Japan, this environment accelerated the movement towards women's suffrage. You could not make the world safe for democracy if you disenfranchised half your population, and you could not have a stable modern democracy if half your citizens were not represented.